this Parsha reading and a lot more this afternoon in the Torah Talk at 1:30. Israel will be leading us, and we'll be looking forward to that. You know, there's so many lessons. There are so many lessons that we can learn from the wilderness experience. And we oftentimes go through what we might describe in our own walk with God as a wilderness experience. Don't be surprised. And the older I get, it's just what happens, right? Well, there's a lot of reasons for a wilderness experience, but these are the lessons, so many lessons that God intends for us to learn as we look at Israel in the wilderness. If we can sum up two great lessons in the wilderness, well, we would learn who man is. And secondly, we learn who God is. You know, and these lessons of who man is and who God is lie side by side in the book of Bamidbar. Now, God rises above all of the unbelief and all of the disobedience, all of the pride, all of the willfulness of His people. God presses on with His own eternal purposes and the fulfillment of His promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. We learn that our Father in heaven is full of grace and full of goodness, forgiveness, and loving discipline. Man, on the other hand, is filled with some other things. Amen. And man has to learn to be graceful. Man has to learn to be good. Man has to learn to be generous to one another. And so we see this contrast, actually, quite vividly. In chapter 14, we have man in his ways, the failure of faith and trust. In chapter 15, we have God in His ways. And now here in chapter 16 and 17, we resume the story of the people of God in the wilderness, and we learn more of man's ways once again. Now in chapter 18, we come back to God's ways. What God intends for His people to live, the kind of life of loving God and loving our neighbor. And yet, even in the midst of man's ways, we understand more of God and His ways. Now, I think it's important for us to focus in a little bit on this dynamic contrast, which is constantly going on. And I think God arranged this so that we see a vivid picture of man and how far man has to move to conform to the image and the ways of God. Let's not lose track of this contrast, because life in Messiah is all about narrowing the gap between man's ways and God's ways. See, our life in Messiah is always about this moving, narrowing the gap, moving more into God's ways, moving closer to God. I think God has arranged it, especially in Numbers for us to see. For us to see. And we have to always see that life in Messiah is moving more in line with God's ways. We must constantly compare our walk with Moses. You see, Moses is this earthly representation of what is God's ways. And all of those who are actually listed in the Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11. And of course, we're being made into the image of our Messiah. For he is the ultimate picture of God's ways. And this is why Yeshua said, as you go into all the world, baptize. Did I leave something out? Did I leave something out? As you go into all the world, make disciples of all men, baptizing them and what? Teaching them to observe all things I've taught you. Yeshua is what it is to walk in the ways of God. And so, this Parsha reading this week is called Korach. It means Korah. Korah was one of he was the head of one of the Levite families. Moses and Aaron are part of the same tribe. A few months must have passed by after God said they would not enter into the land of Israel. Previously, we learned that in Numbers chapter 2, verse 10, on the south side shall be the standard of the camp of Reuben according to their armies. And we read in Numbers 2:29, the families of the sons of Korach shall pitch on the side of the tabernacle southward. And so, these are neighbors. The ones that we are reading about today. They're neighbors on the south side of the tabernacle. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram had apparently influenced 250 leading men who were to influence the whole nation. Now, in the earlier occasions when we see the ways of man, there is this complaining about certain problems, like what am I going to drink? All this food, where's the meat? The desert conditions. Even a need for God to replace Moses. But here, you see, here, we've come to more. This is outright rebellion. An attempt to replace Moses and Aaron. Doubt and discontent turned to contempt and rebellion. They had doubts concerning Moses' leadership. They had doubts concerning whether Moses was really hearing from God. Moses had even appointed his own brother to be the high priest. But here are the lessons. Contention is contagious. It moves like wildfire. This evil spread from 1 to 3, from 3 to the leadership, and even after the people saw the ground opening up, and the consuming fire of God went out, the rest of the people rose up in the same way and said to poor Moses, "You caused death to all those people of God. You were responsible." How did it all begin? Well, it began with one, then three who had a negative attitude about their life. This small number became a powerful influence. It's amazing how Satan can use something like this. They became a powerful influence. Instead of loving their neighbor, they were thinking of ways in which Moses and Aaron were failing and questioning the spoken word of Adonai himself. Just imagine the disappointment of the people. Can you imagine how disappointed you would be when it was announced that you would not move into the land of promise, the land flowing with milk and honey, but you would die in this wilderness? Can you imagine? Can you imagine the struggles that were going on within the hearts of these people who have experienced a huge disappointment and a hard life ahead? No way out for the rest of your life. And here comes your neighbor. Here comes your neighbor. And he tips the scale within you. You see the dynamic that is taking place. He comes with his attitude and he tips the scale. You know, Paul warns us not to even to listen to an accusation against leadership except at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. You see, that's the justice of God. At the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let a matter be established. Now, God is very clear in that. From Genesis to the Revelation, that's main part of his justice system. Peter commands us to likewise, younger ones, be subject to older ones, and all being subject to each other. Everyone needs accountability. Everyone needs accountability, and everyone needs a spiritual authority over them. And the only way that we are able to fulfill this commandment is to put on humility. Put on humility. We have to clothe ourselves with humility. Because God pushes off. He pushes off the proud ones. You see, he resists them. As it says, for God resists the proud ones, but he gives grace to the humble ones. It's just God's ways. And the conclusion is, don't rebel under the mighty hand of God, but therefore be humbled under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time. That's God's purpose. That's what God wants for every one of us. Not to resist us, but to lift us. To lift us up. And that is what he wants to do in every person here. To exalt you in due time. In due time. This has an underlying principle. Casting all your care. Well, the literal says, casting all your anxieties upon him, for he cares for you. Every anxious thought, every anxious feeling needs to be cast upon him, so that we do not infect others with a bad attitude. You see that this attitude of fear and unbelief. And of course, the devil is quick to involve himself. Very quick. So that he can bring hurt and destruction to the people of God. That's his whole life. That's his whole life purpose. Be sensible and vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking someone he may devour, whom firmly resist in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions in the world are being completed in your brotherhood. Are we exempt from affliction or persecution? No. No. God doesn't intend for us not to go through some affliction. He does intend for us to be overcomers in the affliction, overcomers in the complications of life, overcomers in the problems that we face. And the writer of Hebrews says, yield to those leading you, and be submissive, for they watch for your souls as those who must give an account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. I can't imagine the grief that Moses felt during these days recorded here. It was such a grief to his soul. And he was the meekest man of all the earth. One meek, but not weak, but strong in the Lord, for his faith and for his trust. When we find ourselves discontented with the ministry and God's place that he has assigned to us, we're in danger of having these feelings take hold within us. And then it doesn't take much, and we begin to act them out. Maybe rebellion grows out of this seed of discontentment. Discontentment with my role in life. The opposite of discontentment, of course, is contentment, joy. And what's difficult for us is contentment is learned. You know, it's not a natural thing. It's learned. And it grows in the ground of joy and thankfulness. Oh, that is so important, isn't it? Being thankful to God and expressing the joy of the Spirit of God. You see, the providence of God is active in all of our lives, but herein lies the struggle. We have to be convinced that God is for us and He is good to us and He intends good for us. We have to acknowledge His sovereign will and His sovereign purposes, which are really at work within us. We have to be grateful for it and praise Him for it. Every believer has a place. Every believer has a job. Every believer has a ministry. But we have to find out what it is. you know? And we have to work on maturing that gift. And we both contribute to the whole community and as individuals to the ongoing work of God on this earth. You see, in other words, we have a group calling and we have an individual calling. And we are to find our calling, fit into the community, and fulfill our gifting. And we need to be satisfied. You know, it's okay. It's okay. Paul says, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God and Messiah Yeshua toward you. I don't know if I've perfected. In fact, I know I haven't perfected all of this. But this is what we work on, isn't it? Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. God's will for each and every one of us. And herein is the importance of loving our neighbor. Loving our neighbor. See, a negative attitude isn't helping your neighbor any. No, it's not. You're right. And griping and complaining and insinuating faults in others is not loving your neighbor at all. It's posing a huge temptation to your neighbor who's going through some trials of their own. And that's why Ephesians chapter 4, the chapter ends with, may every word you speak build up others. You see, that's loving our neighbors. That's loving one another. And we finish out in chapter 18. We have to realize that we're now back learning about the ways of God, okay? And the Levites, we find out that the Levites own no property and therefore could not earn income in an agrarian economy. They were ministers to the priesthood. They served in the tabernacle in many different ways. They transported the tabernacle in the wilderness, later served the temple as gatekeepers, as guards, as musicians, as singers, leaders in the worship. And so, Torah specifies 2 tithes. In addition to the offerings you would bring and the dedicated portions you would bring. And we have trouble with 1 tithe. Okay? We have problems with 1 tithe. You know, once you solve the issue with 1 tithe, the 2 tithes, it doesn't bother you at all. Oh, I have always wondered why the Torah always returns to certain lessons over and over and over again. Certain things keep popping up. Now, the first tithe is specific to our reading here in Numbers. But the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. They shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a never-ending statute throughout your generations, that in the midst of the sons of Israel they shall have no inheritance. But the tithes of the sons of Israel, which they shall lift up to Adonai, a heave offering to him, I've given to the Levites for inheritance. Therefore I've said to them, they shall have no inheritance among the sons of Israel. They were dependent upon the obedience of God's people. You see, the first tithe was considered a heave offering or a dedicated offering. It was lifted up to the Lord. In other words, it was sanctified to the Lord. It was made holy. It was given to the Levites. The second tithe is specified in Leviticus 27 and Deuteronomy 14. During the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the 7-year cycle, the second tithe was set aside to be taken to Jerusalem to support your family during celebrations like Sukkot. Isn't that cool? The second tithe of the 3rd and 6th year was given to the poor and needy. Now that's cool. Now that's important. And in addition to this, all of the people brought their own offerings to the tabernacle and then paid an annual tax of a half shekel to support the tabernacle and temple services. And so all of the people had the privilege to support the temple services, the priesthood, and the Levites, so that the worship and service of Adonai would be a continuing reality within the community of Israel. I don't think we understand how foundational this is to the ongoing work and ministry of God on this earth. Last year I spent probably 80% or more of the whole teaching on this important issue of tithing. I thought about, but too late, to print that one out for last year and to have it available. But if anybody would like to have it available, I'd be glad to make it available to you, because what I'm sharing with you today is in addition to all of that of last year. Now, I do acknowledge that this is a struggle for many of us. And I would like for you to seriously deal with it at this time. We generally have a limited view of the scope of the tithe. And we all struggle with giving 10%. However, the tithe of the Torah is more like 20%, with 10% supporting the Levites and priests and 10% spent on giving to the poor and festival expenses for your families. God wants all of us to get together and experience the joy of community in the worship of God. And God is concerned that all the family be involved. If all of the commandments would hang, like Yeshua teaches us, upon the two great commandments, love your God and love your neighbor, then the tithe is an application of love your neighbor. If all of the commandments would fall under one of the 5 big commandments of loving our neighbor, where do you think? What commandment would you think the tithe would fall under? And of course, you would be right. For the tithe would fall under the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his slave servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything which belongs to your neighbor. The Hebrew word for covet is chamad, and it means to desire, covet, take pleasure in, delight in. And all of the mitzvot that relate to a person holding on to that which is not theirs, desiring what is not theirs, falls under this commandment. And of course, this would include giving of tithes and special vows. The commandments related to the tithe could have been placed under the 8th commandment regarding theft, since the confessions of the tither in Deuteronomy chapter 26 seems to indicate this. The positive mitzvah, 131, they're all numbered, as you know, commands us to confess when we bring our tithes that we have brought all of that which has been written for us to bring, which is an affirmation that we are not withholding anything that belongs to Adonai. Since all belongs to Him, and He gives us out of His grace enough to manage. And the managing of that which God gives prepares us for greater ministry. As I'm reminding somewhere in the back of my head, one of the parables of Yeshua. A positive mitzvah 132 is actually the recital. It's designed to create a certain degree of humility in recounting the facts of his past, that his father Abraham was a wanderer, and that the people of Israel have been brought out of Egypt. They were in bondage and were brought out. The recital affirms that any increase that a person has is a result of the blessing of Adonai, and not from the efforts of the individual. It concludes by affirming, I brought away the holy things out of my house, and also have given them to the Levite, to the stranger, to the fatherless, and to the widow, according to all of the commandments which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed your commandments, neither have I forgotten them. Amen. Now, the apostolic scriptures, well, let me insert this very quickly. Let me insert this very quickly. You see, we begin to understand what the tithe is in Genesis with Abraham and Melchizedek, and we understand a tithe. In Torah, we understand 2 tithes. But when we get to the apostolic scriptures, we understand that in the early community they gave all. And from all that was given, they distributed to every single person who had a need. You see the progression? And it's a progress in our understanding of the tithe. Well, the apostolic scriptures all through, although not mentioning the giving of the tithe directly, and I have a funny feeling why it is not mentioned directly. Yet it affirms the teachings of Yeshua when he said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And it also affirms the teachings of the commandments regarding the tithe. The apostolic scriptures do not need to specifically command the tithe any more than they need to specifically command the remembrance and the observance of the Sabbath. And so we find that this is nothing new, nor is it of just the law, but it is from Genesis right on through an important ancient practice. And we understand from the prophets that it's important to God. And we understand from Yeshua that the tithe is generous and not restrictive. I just trust that God will work. And I trust that God would work at all of us. This is the one area, of course, that is so important in our testimony of what God began to do. After so many years in ministry, God began to do a new work, a messianic work in us, and how God provided far beyond our own thinking or imaginations. God established His work, His way, with His offerings. It just all came together. And I'll be honest with you, I'm scared to death not to tithe. I'm afraid not to be generous. But to love my neighbor.